Zurich Life Assurance.
Chances of a poll on a united Ireland are growing, and I would love to know, would you support a united Ireland, or are you happy with how things are? My next guest says that a united Ireland will depend on long, careful planning and also on finding out who can actually vote on the issue. And I'm joined now by Fianna Fáil Senator Mark Daly to discuss this. Mark, you're very welcome. Obviously, you've written about this. Under what circumstances do you think a referendum, a border poll, might be called imminently?
Well, I suppose the lesson of Brexit, as you said, is there's the requirement for long-term preparation and engagement with all sides. You don't hold a referendum without having all that preparation done. But the research report that I've just compiled with a legal team examined a case in Northern Ireland where the Secretary of State was actually the defendant in the case. The case was taken by a unionist who was a victims' rights campaigner, but he wanted the Secretary of State to come out with the policy on under what circumstances a referendum would be called. How would the Secretary of State determine that the majority of people were in fact in favour of a united Ireland? Would it be election results or opinion polls? But what we discovered in all the legal documents submitted by the Secretary of State was that, in fact, the Secretary of State also has the power to decide who gets to vote in that referendum and has the sole power. So, we know that Northern Ireland has a tragic and long history of denying people the right to vote. We cannot have a situation where the referendum on a united Ireland would be another chapter in that sad story.
So who might be excluded from voting? Presumably all Irish citizens or British citizens, whichever way they would choose to identify themselves, would not be excluded.
Well,
of a certain age.
That's actually up to the Secretary of State. So currently under the UK Referendum Act, it's people who are 18 and older, who are UK citizens, Irish citizens and Commonwealth citizens. However, in the Scottish independence referendum, that voter franchise was expanded 2 years before the referendum took place in Scotland alone. So people who were 16, 17 years and older were allowed to vote, but also EU citizens were allowed to vote in that referendum. And we can see from the exit polls, which were done by YouGov, that had a huge impact on the outcome. So the Scottish independence referendum was lost by 45% against and 55% for. However, when you analysed the vote by people who were born in Scotland, it was lost only 49-51%. But UK citizens born outside of Scotland but living in Scotland voted against Scottish independence by a factor of 74%. And EU citizens voted against it by 57%. So as you can see, who's allowed to vote will determine the outcome. And as it currently stands, the person who decides who's allowed to vote is the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State alone. And the Secretary of State has not yet decided who's allowed to vote.
Is that not a little different, Mark? Surely, with respect, in the north, the population of EU citizens who are non-British, non-Irish is particularly small. There's not. Scotland is slightly more cosmopolitan than Northern Ireland. The history of sectarianism and of violence has not, I suppose, thrown the doors open in a way that huge numbers of people want to live there.
There's still quite a large number of people, and bordering 100,000. And then you have people who are from the Commonwealth, but also the issue of should 16 and 17-year-olds be allowed to vote, as happened in Scotland. And as it stands, because the Secretary of State will not actually say who's allowed to vote, then we don't know what the outcome will be. But of particular importance is the irony is that the Secretary of State keeps saying the threshold hasn't been met, and yet you can't say that unless you first of all determine who's allowed to vote.
Yeah, I take what you're saying, and it is at his discretion currently whether or not the border poll would be called. But even were it to be called, and even were it to be carried, do you think, equally those south of the border have to be asked the same question? Do we want a united Ireland? I know that it is about 2/3 to 1/3. The polls here have shown a consistent majority in favour of a united Ireland. But there is a lot to consider, and presumably in the run-up to a referendum, both sides of the argument, our referendum commissions have to do this, would put the arguments to the people of the south against having a united Ireland. Things like the expense, things like perhaps a disgruntled unionist community being welcomed into the fold and having to accommodate them in various ways. Is there a possibility that we might see people in the north voting to have a united Ireland, and people in the south voting against?
Well, I suppose in the north, the unionist community in a Lord Ashcroft poll believe that there will be a united Ireland within 10 years. And in the south, as you've said, polls show between 60 to 80%, depending on how the question is phrased, in favour of united Ireland. And the issue of cost, which you brought up, was an issue that I did look at as part of the report that I did for the Good Friday Agreement Implementation Committee on a united Ireland. And I worked with Gunther Thurman, who was a senior economist at the IMF during German reunification, to look at what is the real expenditure of Northern Ireland in a reunification scenario. And the 9.2 billion that keeps being touted about as the running cost for Northern Ireland, the deficit for Northern Ireland, is actually, a lot of that is not applicable in a reunification scenario, Gunther Thurman found out. And he said, included in that figure is Northern Ireland's share of British military global spending, Northern Ireland's share of its EU contribution, which obviously wouldn't apply anymore, and Northern Ireland's share of the UK national debt. Also included is student loan schemes, quantitative easing by the UK Treasury, and also the issue of the public service, which Gunther outlined should be rationalised over time by people retiring. And then there's the issue of pensions, which is an interesting issue because there's about 2.9 billion worth of pensions being paid into Northern Ireland by the British government. And because the contributions were made to Britain during its time, then those pension contributions would continue. So in fact, it's not, Gunther found out, 9.2 billion of a deficit, it's about 700 million in a reunification scenario. So that's why we're trying to get to all the facts.
I hear what you're saying about that, and I've heard the 9.2 and I've heard the 700 million. But equally, it is a fact that in terms of employment in Northern Ireland, there is a huge amount of people on social welfare, A, and B, a huge amount of people employed in the public sector of Northern Ireland. And if we were to take over both of those things, all other things being equal, it would cost us considerably more than 700 million.
Well, that's why you need long-term planning and engagement. In fact, the public sector accounts for 11.4% of the population in Northern Ireland, whereas the public sector here is 8.4%. That's why, when people retire, you'd have to look at whether they should be replaced. There's a whole rationalisation.
Unemployment runs much higher. We do know that too.
We do know that too, but that's also where the opportunities lie, because in a reunification scenario, as happened with East Germany, we see Northern Ireland obviously heading out of the EU. It's going to have a huge impact in Northern Ireland, and that's why even unionists are looking at it and saying, well, you know what, a united Ireland might be better than a Brexit Britain, and all the economic indicators are they would be. But that depends on the Irish government preparing, and Leo Varadkar said on Friday that they're not preparing, and that is not learning the lesson.
So you feel that we should be, lastly, just with regard to the unionist population, the unionist population for the first time in my memory are now saying things like we need to respect the Good Friday Agreement and all that's contained within, and it used to be the other way around. There was the nationalist community used to say those things, and that is to do with swinging demographics, that the unionist population see themselves as perhaps becoming the minority and therefore wanting the protections. But do we need to get our heads around, Mark Daly, the fact that if we are to become a united Ireland and the unionist population now are maybe elected to Dáil Éireann down in Leinster House and maybe are Irish citizens of a Republic of Ireland community, that we are going to have to make concessions towards them by way of maybe the flag, by maybe the national anthem, or by other concessions that would show us as not a cold house to unionism. And have we got a plan in place for that?
Well, absolutely. And I looked at that issue as well about identity, which is the central concern of the unionist community, that their identity would be denied. And the way we have to look at that is in a new way. Rather than giving people new identities, new flags, new anthems, we accommodate identity. So it would be a matter of accommodating not just unionist identity, but also the nationalist identity, not taking flags away from people, but like the rugby they accommodate identity. They fly the tricolour, they fly the Ulster flag, they have two anthems when they play at home. There's issues with that, but it's about being generous, and Seamus Mallon talked about that, about being willing to be more generous to them than they were to us. But that is about setting forward a vision for the whole island and all its people for the next 100 years, and that does require careful planning.
Look, no, thank you for that, Mark, and I do take on board. It's a very interesting conversation. Thank you for that indeed. That's Fianna Fáil Senator Mark Daly.